Friends, thank you very much for joining us. James, great to see you.
Great to see you too, Ian. Yeah, yeah.
You sound like you're refreshed.
I've been away. I've been hamming it up at General Synod, and then particularly refreshed by new wine leaders in Harrogate, which is
Fantastic.
which has been good. What about you?
Good.
You're looking pretty refreshed too, actually.
Yeah, I know. Instead of going to New Wine Leaders, I had a couple of days in Paris with my wife for her birthday. So
Yeah, it's all right for some, isn't it?
it, it is, but once you're in London, it's only 2 hours. So hey, it was
Yeah,
actually
sure.
quicker for me to go to Paris than it was for you to go to Harrogate. So
Yeah, probably was. Yeah, yeah.
there we go. Well, let's get back to the reading. So we've got a bit of a choice to make in the lectionary this week.
We have, because it's both the fourth Sunday of Lent and, of course, as ever, Mothering Sunday.
Right.
So one needs to choose between a set of Mothering Sunday readings and a Lent 4 reading.
But the Mothering Sunday readings are not much. I mean, a bit of a funny choice, aren't they?
They are a bit of a funny choice, particularly in the New Testament. I mean, you either have about 2 or 3 verses from John 19, where you have Jesus at the cross saying to the beloved disciple, behold your mother, saying to the mother, behold your son, etc.
Yeah.
Or you can choose a passage from Luke 2 in the story of Simeon and Anna, where, as we looked at the other week around Candlemas, Jesus,
We did.
the comment is that
Sword will pierce your heart.
Simeon will sword will pierce your soul too,
Yeah.
to Mary about Jesus. So,
Well, very a cheery reflection on motherhood.
neither of them are particularly. I mean, the Old Testament passages, Exodus 2 and Moses.
Yes.
Once again, I mean, interesting passage.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we're going to steer clear of those, but it's worth just noticing. I think
Hmm.
it feels a little bit like if you choose to preach on the subject of Mothering Sunday, why would you anyway? We don't preach on fathering, do we? Much? I don't
No.
know. Maybe we do. There's a bit of an elephant trap, isn't there? Because of course you then have to, if you're going to talk about mothers, you then got to talk about people who aren't mothers and who want to be mothers and the pain of that as well. But there might be a more constructive way to engage with the subject.
Well, I've always tried to be much more positive in the sense that, and even this is fraught with difficulty, that everybody has a mother. So, by definition, or has had a mother. We've all come from mothers. So, that seems to me a more inclusive way of dealing with things, even if some of those relationships obviously are ambiguous or difficult. I suppose in a sense everybody has a complicated relationship with their parents in some level. And so there is
Philip Larkin had something to say about that, but I'm not going to repeat it here.
He did actually on a Mothering Sunday. I once heard his poem with a different word
edited.
used.
Okay, that's good.
An edited version, but it was quite interesting. Yes, the preacher did use that. So interesting.
Yeah. Just on that note, the phrase you used there reminds me of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, which we're not going to dive into, but interesting to note that he acknowledges that in the creation story, the woman comes from the man, in other words, because Eve is drawn from the side of Adam. But he responds to that by saying, yes, but every man comes from a woman.
Yeah.
We're all born of a mother.
Yeah.
By which means he then introduces this symmetry of interdependence between male and female, which I think is fascinating. So instead of plunging into all those elephant traps, what are we going to do?
We have for Lent 4, if you're going to keep the fourth Sunday of Lent, then you have John chapter 3 and verses 14 to 22. Now, that's quite an interesting passage because it starts. It feels as though you start in the middle of an argument, which I think we do.
Yeah, we do.
And it's the end of this story of Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus.
Yeah.
And what we end up here is it's an extraordinary passage, isn't it? Because
it is.
The tone shifts from this very personal, intense conversation with Nicodemus, and then just before the beginning of our passage, we see a shift, don't we?
Yeah,
in the language.
We do. Yes, because it looks as though, I mean, very characteristic of this gospel. There's a lot of one-to-one encounters, and if you want, I mean, for instance, if you want a sermon series on the fourth gospel, one of the things you can do very easily is Jesus encounters with individuals. And I always think, I mean, some people have talked about this, there's almost a kind of cinematic characteristic to this gospel because the disciples aren't around very much. They sort of disappear from view very, very quickly. And you kind of like the cinema lens, the camera lens zooms in intensely on Jesus and one individual. And every now and then in some of these encounters, you get a little hint that other people are around. and it reminds me of that joke about it was an old joke about telling a story, and there's a story about two people, and then there are three pieces of cake because it's one for each person, and one piece of cake for the person telling the story. So you do get this sense of so the narrator is narrating these intensely personal encounters, but as you say, we then have this shift to the we
Yes.
language, don't we? It's in verse 11, isn't it?
Yeah, so it becomes that you becomes plural here, and it's
Yeah.
interesting that Nicodemus kind of fades from view, and it's almost as if the crowd is being addressed. It's or the reader particularly actually is addressed. And what's also the other interesting thing is this: we're not clear whether these are the words of Jesus or whether they're really the words of the writer of the fourth gospel. And there's kind of merging, and it's I don't know if you've got any sort of red letter editions, but of the scriptures.
I'm looking at a red letter edition, and in my own version, the
Oh,
red letters words go up to verse 14. 15,
right.
15 are in red, but there's a little footnote there saying some interpreters end the quotation later. I don't know if
Yeah.
other people end the quotation earlier in Jesus' speech earlier.
Well, it is interesting because the NIV changed its mind between its
Oh, right.
its two editions. So the 2011 edition decided that it wasn't the words of Jesus that from verse 16 onwards. But the previous edition decided it was the words of Jesus right up to the end of our passage. So interesting.
Now, there's two ways to look at this, and I think we might say critical scholarship has asked a historical question about is this really the concerns of the next generation projected back onto it? So, of course, within the fourth gospel, there's the language in chapter 9 about being put out of the synagogue. So, and a critical historical argument says, well, this text is really the creation of the early church projected back onto the ministry of Jesus. So we could engage with that. It's worth noting, though, that there's a literary theological way of reading this, which I found really helpful. John Goldingay's old book from the 1990s, Models of Scripture, where he notes that the four different gospels actually have four different ways of telling the story and making the point. So Mark has a driving narrative. Matthew locates Jesus' teaching within and organizes it so it correlates with issues around the law. And then he puts the fourth gospel next and notes that you get this blending of the words of Jesus with their reception in the context of the next generation. And I think we noticed that last week as well, didn't we? Because we noted that when Jesus is cleansing the temple, you get that noted explicitly where the narrator says, and the disciples remembered the meaning of this, and remembered this about Jesus. So it is actually acknowledging that the words of Jesus are being interpreted in another context.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's a really helpful matter to consider. I think what one has to be, and I think you were sort of beginning to kind of tilt at this, but I mean, one needs to be careful of that, about the idea that the early Christian we get the stuff from the early Christian communities structure, interpretation of all of this, because if it was that, then they don't notice quite a lot of quite important things.
Oh, no.
They don't do a very good job.
Yeah.
In that sense. So
well, I mean, the two most obvious ones are the fact, again, this language that we find here and we found before, the Son of Man language, which in the next generation, the followers of Jesus don't seem to very much of.
No, they don't.
On the one hand. On the other hand, they've got this massive question about the Gentile mission.
Yes.
And they don't have anything. They're scratching around for things in the teaching of Jesus which will resolve this issue for them. So it would have been, if they are making up the teaching of Jesus, as I said, they could have done a much better job to address the primary issues that they themselves were facing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Where do we get to now? The Son of Man language. Do we want to talk about that? No, am I jumping ahead? Yes, no, I know I am. No, this is where
that is where we begin, I think, isn't it, really?
It is.
Just as Moses lifted up the serpent, so must the Son of Man be lifted up.
Yeah. Just again, very interesting, isn't it? To see that the Son of Man language, which is so common in the synoptics, also features here. And I know we talked before about, particularly in Mark's gospel, which we're reading alongside the fourth gospel here as well. So we talked explicitly within Mark's gospel. You can see the multiple dimensions of the Son of Man language picked up from the Old Testament. So Jesus as a Son of Man who is archetypal human being. Jesus is the Son of Man who's vulnerable in contrast to the eternity of God. And then Jesus, the Son of Man, who will be exalted to the throne, the Daniel 7 language as well. And although we don't see those three things teased out quite so explicitly in this gospel, we do see this language of being lifted up in exaltation.
We do. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in a sense, the writer of the fourth gospel has been pointing us towards the death of Jesus right from the very beginning.
Yes.
Though this is the first time the language of being lifted up is actually used. So, you've got the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world in chapter 1. You've got my hour has not yet come, chapter 2. You've got destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up, and he meant the temple of his body. So you've had these kind of hints of this, and then at this point we get another hint of it, but the language of being lifted up, it now becomes something which the writer of the fourth gospel refers to multiple times, and it becomes clear that this is a really important lens for our understanding of the cross of Jesus, that it's actually the high point, the throne. There's this elevation, and that's picked up in chapter 8 and in chapter 12 as well. So we're beginning to get the point about the meaning of the cross for the writer of the fourth gospel. That's what we is kind of coming into view. But there's these hints all the way through, which is really interesting, isn't it?
I like your use of the word hint, because in verse 14, we've just got one single reference to this episode in Numbers 21.
Yeah.
And in Numbers 21, it is quite a significant episode. The fact that there is the venomous snakes amongst the people that they are bitten by, but Moses makes a bronze snake and lifts it up. And I have to say, when you read the passage Numbers 21, it's all a little bit odd, a little bit mysterious. And we only have one little hint. I mean, I suppose it's a little bit like with Nathaniel, where Jesus sort of has this very compressed allusion to the Jacob's ladder, so on, going up and down. And here you just simply said, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And there's two or three things I think are really fascinating here. One is that, well, Moses did lift up the snake on the pole in the desert, but Numbers 21 doesn't use that language. It doesn't mention the word lifted up.
No.
So the writer of the fourth gospel here is doing something with the passage. And the other thing which is really interesting, well, obviously the theme here is that healing. People look to the snake and are healed. So as you say, the inference is that people will look to Jesus on the cross, and he's the source of healing. Now, the fact he's the source of healing, I find fascinating, rather than, as elsewhere, the source of forgiveness. So, I mean, one of the things I find myself talking to people who don't know anything about the gospel is to say, well, okay, so we use this language of sin, which is like religious language, but look, here's the reality. I do things which hurt and harm other people, and they do things which hurt and harm me. What is the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection? It is, number one, I can be forgiven for the harm I've done to others, but I can be healed from the harm they've done to me as well. It feels to me as though in contemporary context, we need to hold those two together. So it's fascinating that the healing image is to the fore here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in that original context in Numbers 21, I mean, this was something that threatened the whole of the people of God, wasn't it? I mean, they could have been wiped out by these, or substantially wiped out by the activity of the snake. So there is a sense in which the illusion here is very profound, in the sense that our sin and those that absolutely, as you speak about it, damages all of us. We are all universally profoundly affected by the effects of sin, both our own sin and the sin of others. So there is a kind of universal sense here, which is saying everybody needs to look. But it was a life and death matter in Numbers 21, wasn't it?
Yes, and I almost wonder, again, just prompted by your language there, put this in the context of the first century, and particularly the crisis of the destruction of the temple, because we've had that temple language in chapter 2. And in Jewish context, and remember, the conflicts in this gospel are intra-Jewish. They're not a conflict between Christians on the one hand and Jews on the other.
No.
It's a conflict about who Jesus is within different strands of first century Judaism, or the first century Judaisms. And of course, the destruction of the temple is as exactly the same way a threat to national life. So in fact, Jesus is saving the identity of the people of God from their own destruction. There is kind of a political dynamic to it as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The other thing is really, sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's worth noting something that Joanne Brandt does in her commentary, which is
Yes.
really, really very helpful.
Have you got it there?
Yes, I think I have actually.
Wave it to our viewers.
Thank you, Joanne. Waving it. I found it. Wait, there we are.
There you go. It's in the Padilla series.
It's really worth a read. Very, very.
We've mentioned when we were doing Luke, we mentioned Michael Parsons' commentary
in the same series.
Yeah, and in fact, Michael is a series editor for the commentary series.
Yeah. And she tends to take a rhetorical, critical approach. So, and that's her area of expertise, I guess. And she talks about what follows from the encounter with Nicodemus is basically a series of 4 proofs of Jesus' comment to Nicodemus that you must be born from above. And actually, structurally, she says we're diving in verse 14 at the second proof, a proof by analogy, and the word proof is she carefully defines that in terms
of a rhetorical proof, a demonstration, proof, not a sort of scientific proof.
Yes, in terms of Aristotelian sort of understanding that. So it's something that moves the argument in a particular direction. So that's interesting that this is sort of number 2, and then the rest of our passage we have number 3 and 4. So I just think that's quite
okay. We'll pick those out when we come. Just one other last thing to observe about this connection with Numbers 21, and that is that when you look at the Hebrew text, it doesn't really give any sense of a parallel, but the Greek translation, the Septuagint, actually, when it says that the snake was fixed on the pole, it uses the word semeion, meaning sign. And that you can see why the writer of the fourth gospel reading that in Greek and say, aha, the sign. And then this fits in with the sign structures. And it also suggests that, but there's a debate about this, that there are 7 signs within the fourth gospel, and then the resurrection of Jesus is the 8th sign, which the others point to. So the 8th being the completion and the stepping into the new age. And again, there's this big debate about how do you make sense of the relationship between things we find in the Old Testament, which are then picked up as anticipations, interpretations, clues to keys to understanding Jesus. And so you get this idea of a figure of or a type of Christ in the Old Testament, and then you get this idea of the sensus plenior, or the fuller meaning of it. And I'm not persuaded by any of that, mainly because that's not how language functions. I think it's much more helpful to say, actually, let's look back, and we see the writer of the fourth gospel here saying, here's something in the Old Testament, part of the story of the people of God, that if I read it theologically, it gives me insight, because we see the same kind of pattern of what's going on here. So God's people are facing judgment, and they're facing death, but God makes a provision for their healing. By the way, I know this is getting slightly off track. I've got to be careful not to go down this rabbit hole, but there is a rather unhelpful meme going around, I don't know whether you've seen, where when which says a little dialogue between Jesus and an unbeliever, and Jesus says, you must believe in me to save me, to be saved. And the person says, saved from what? And the answer is saved from God. So God is saving us from God. So that doesn't make any sense at all. Have you seen that? Oh, no, it's I obviously moved in slightly different circles from you. So
yes.
But and the danger is that's a misreading of the language of being saved by judgment. And we're going to get into the judgment. But actually, that's a misreading, because what God saves us from in Jesus is the reality of the consequences of the lives we've lived. So God's judgment is about saying, this is reality. These are the consequences of how you've lived and the choices you've made. And because God is the bearer of reality, that doesn't mean that God is saving us from God. It means God is saving us from the consequences of the choices that we've made. But
yes,
anyway, it's a little bit rabbit hole to go.
But it's also quite helpful, isn't it? Because what as you were saying, the way the writer of the fourth gospel looks to the Old Testament to understand theologically what's happening in Jesus, there is also this sense in which what we're discovering is this is the way the world is. This is the way God operates within the world, and there's a consistency here between the way that worked in Numbers 21 and the way it works in Jesus.
Yes, absolutely.
But also in the next verse, in the next proof, as it were, on John 3:16, you've got this similar thing that we've talked about before, where this is the nature of how God saves the world is through sacrifice, through the sacrifice of a life, and that's why we have this problem, don't we, with this translation of "for God so loved the world." It's not so much, but it's the how he has, and that's what's really, I think that's what's really interesting, and how these allusions help us, because they say, actually, this is the way the way God has made the world to be. This is the way God operates within the world. And we might have ideas about how he ought to operate or what his love ought to look like, but actually that's not the case. We need to look at what is actually there.
No. And by the way, the Bible Project video on Leviticus is fantastic because it does exactly that. It says, look, this is the pattern through means of the offering of sacrifice that God makes peace with his people. And that's why reading Leviticus and understanding the sacrificial system is vital for understanding this metaphor of sacrifice in the life of Jesus. So it is. Now, I've got a bit of a hesitation here, James. You've sort of launched us into it. I do feel inherently nervous about saying, folks, you've always misread this really well-known Bible verse, because I dislike it when other people come up to me and say, oh, well,
it's really
you've
annoying.
never understood it, and this is the real meaning of it. So I am a bit nervous about it, but nevertheless, we do have to tackle this head on, don't we?
I think we do. I think we do, because this word in Greek, which is translated so in many English translations, not
they're beginning to
not
change.
So much now, actually, but
I've got in front of me the Net Bible, which says, for this is the way God loved the world, which is getting there. So but what is interesting here is the legacy of tradition, because obviously we're working with the King James version, or the legacy of that, for God so loved the world. But of course, in 1611, if you so do something, it means you do it in this way. So I walked so, or in fact in the Book of Common Prayer, it says, so God loved the world, which you can't misinterpret. It actually means in this way, God loved the world. So we should note, for those of you scholars, there is a bit of a scholarly debate about this, but I'm convinced that in this way is the right way to read this. So, but when this verse is so well known in the King James Version, it gets embedded in our consciousness, and then translators, I think, are very hesitant to challenge that.
Well, absolutely. It's interesting, isn't it? The Book of Common Prayer, so God loved the world. I mean, you couldn't say that in English now.
No.
For it to make any sense. So it can only make sense if it means in this way God loved the world.
Thusly, I sometimes say.
Thusly, which thusly is a very helpful word, because it's such a, well, it's not a word, so making it into a word, it makes it helpful to remember.
But a couple of things to notice in this verse as well. One is the repetition from verse 15 of eternal life. So we don't find much mention of the kingdom, and we do find the language of now, eternal life, I suppose we'd naturally interpret that as being life that lasts forever. But in fact, it's a bit more than that. It's life of the age to come, isn't it? So this is this realized eschatology of the fourth gospel, where life of the age to come, life of the kingdom to come, is pulled into the present by Jesus' death, resurrection, and the gift of the Spirit. So we get that realization. But also we get this language about the world. God so loved the world. And then you get the exposition here. The Son did not come into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. But the world has not received him, and the world rejects him. So it seems to me that the ambiguity around light, darkness, around salvation, judgment is connected with the ambiguity that this gospel has about the world itself.
Absolutely, and the way the writer of the fourth gospel uses that word "world" is really important, isn't it? It's because it's a bit like the way, in a sense, that word Jew is used. We need to understand it within the context in each passage afresh, don't we? And have to be quite careful about that. And as you say, here there's an ambiguity, because God loves the world, but the world is also all that is opposed to God.
And I think that ambiguity unfolds through the gospel. So in chapter 1, we get immediately introduced that the world was made through him, but it has not recognized or received him. So you already see this sort of bifurcation of different things. And of course, by the time we get to chapter 15, the world now hates Jesus. And in chapter 16, Jesus says, in this world, you will have tribulation. But behold, he says, I have overcome the world. Now, that's really is pushing the dynamic to an extreme, where the world is in opposition to Jesus, and Jesus has actually overcome the world at the same time as dying for the world and loving the world. So it really, that opposition becomes quite intense, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, absolutely.
I also think we need to hold on to this, and we've been set up for this in the previous bit about exaltation, because on the one hand, the language of being lifted up is language of exaltation. There's that song, I think, which is scripturally derived, Lord, I lift your name on high. So on the one hand, and again, the fourth gospel here is really strong on this, Jesus's crucifixion is his being lifted up and glorified, paradoxically, because it's a moment of salvation. But of course, for the world, which is opposed to Jesus, this lifting up is a rejection. So it seems to me that the three paradoxes, one about the world, one about what Jesus' death means and his lifting up, and one about is this salvation or judgment. These three paradoxes seem to me to be all interconnected.
I think they are. And it's interesting that the language of being lifted up is, particularly in this part of the gospel, it's very much about Jesus being lifted up by others. I mean, he's lifted up, isn't he, by those who crucify him?
Yeah.
But paradoxically, he's also lifted up, exalted by the Father. I mean, that is so there you've got it's a really interesting kind of interplay between those two ideas of this something being done unto Jesus, but also by sinful humanity, but then used by God and also exalted by him.
And again, it's once we get to John 10, we see again that theme picked up where Jesus is insisting on his own sovereignty over this. No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. So again, a paradox about what's happening to him, which appears to be out of his control, actually is the thing that was always intended.
Yeah.
And then we get right into this paradox of salvation and judgment, and I guess we're reluctant to get into this. So very often people will know John 3:16, but they don't really want to read on to John to verse 18. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they've not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. And in fact, when we're faced with this paradox, the gospel writer comes and, using the language of Jesus, which is already used, kind of resolves it, which is to say, look, when you light a light, your intention is not to create shadows, it's to enlighten. But creating a shadow is the inevitable consequence of lighting a light. And in the same way, saying once salvation is offered in Jesus, and this is the way, the inevitable consequence of that is that if those who don't accept the way, those who don't stand in the light, are in the darkness.
Yes, the ministry of Jesus essentially brings clarity to the human condition, doesn't it? And the state of the world. And I wonder if it's just worth also just commenting on what believing in Jesus means here, but believing in the name of the only Son of God. That's quite a tricky thing sometimes, isn't it? I mean, people struggle with that. Is it simply a sort of intellectual assent that, or something like that? But actually, really, here it's about the fullness of receiving the death and resurrection of Jesus as the thing that actually has changed and transformed the world. This is the pivotal moment of history. I mean, that's all in view there, isn't it? And therefore, then going on to live your life as a follower, as a disciple of Jesus, and imitating his life, and receiving that view of the world, which is the divine understanding of how the world is.
Maybe then that links to a fourth paradox. So we talked about the paradox of the world, the paradox of the cross, and the paradox of life and judgment, and that then feeds through. And in fact, later in the gospel we see this explicitly. That feeds through to the paradox that we experience, which is that some people receive our testimony and it brings life, but for others it's objectionable and causes problems. I wonder whether that's the same sort of idea. I mean, it's just fascinating. Well, I do love the fact that when we pick on these theological issues that arise in the text, we find them expressed elsewhere. I love the fact that in 2 Corinthians, Paul says, for death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. So he's caught up in that paradox of ministry, that he feels broken and rejected in many ways, but actually in doing so, in living that broken life of Jesus, actually that is bringing, as he pours his life out, that is bringing life to others. And that's the path of discipleship.
Yeah, we had an interesting encounter at New Wine where we met with somebody randomly on a table, and it turned out they were a 16-year-old when I was a curate, and they're now a curate in ministry. And we went through quite a difficult time in our curacy. It was a tough time, and life was, there didn't appear to be much fruit. But it was an absolute joy 30 years later to find this person absolutely thriving and full of the Holy Spirit. And it was great joy. And that is the nature. I think that's what Paul is talking about, isn't it? There's death in us, but life in you. Yeah.
And again, picked up in the language of seed in John 12, but also in the parable of the sower, in Mark 4 that we looked at too. So, the seed is scattered and you just don't know what soil it's going to fall on.
No.
Let's just finish by a little quotation from William Temple. I think it's really helpful from his reflections, his readings in St. John's Gospel. He says this great saying, he's talking going back to John 3:16, this great saying states the mode of Jesus' sovereignty and therefore also the quality of his kingdom. The throne of that kingdom in this world is a cross, and its crown is made of thorns. It's this revolutionary disclosure which gives ground for the sharp dismissal of diplomatic compliments. The whole conception of the kingdom is so novel that only those who are ready to make a new start can even see it, let alone enter it. James, we didn't say at the beginning all the things we love people to do.
No, well, we'd love you to like the videos. Do click like. Do subscribe to the channel. You'll get notifications. Do comment on the social media.
On the social media,
and do share.
Yes,
as well. Yeah.
Click on the link and pass it around.
Yeah.
James, thank you very much. Friends, look forward to seeing you again next time.